Good evening and welcome to this weekly book study we have here at New Covenant House. We are currently reading Christian Anarchism by Alexander Christoyanopoulos. Looks like this. And we've been doing that for a while, so we are now in chapter 2. And it's in numbered sections, and the one we're in right now is number 2.5. And it has to do with forgive 77 times. I believe it's actually 7 times 70. But the number is not really that relevant. We'll see that in a minute. So this is one of the 2 outreaches that we have here at New Covenant House. On Wednesday nights, we are reading this book. And on Tuesday nights, we are studying now our vision document. We have finally gotten the first draft of our vision document, and we kind of go over all the little details of that on Tuesday nights. So if you're interested in doing that, you can join us on Tuesdays instead. But tonight it's about forgiveness. In this chapter, we've been talking about the expectations that the Jews had for Jesus' ministry, and we've heard about his temptations in the wilderness and some of the miracles that he performed so far. And now we're coming into another section where we're going to also be talking about 3 things. Number 1, forgiveness. That's tonight. Next week is going to be about judging people, and in 2 weeks we're going to talk about service. So this is the little story where I think it's Peter asks Jesus how many times he's supposed to be forgiving. He thinks that 7 is enough, but Jesus tells him that it's not, and he should continually forgive. So the book here says that that they should forgive 77 times, as if to say they should never give up forgiving. So it's something that you need to do continually. And we have mentioned before, when we talked about Tolstoy's views, that he says that following Jesus is not easy. I think it was Tolstoy. Yeah, Tolstoy. And it's full of sacrifice and forgiveness. And it's kind of a little bit depressing that it's mostly things that are something we don't want to do, that are central in Christianity. But that's what it is. And the reason why we need to do that is why strive so much to forgive again and again? That's the question. Because for Christian anarchists, only thus can humanity break out of the silence, the cycle of violence which was examined in chapter 1. So we talked about this vicious cycle of violence that Jesus is talking about. He's saying, resist not evil, and by that he means that when some people do evil to you, you should not respond in kind. You should turn the other cheek. We see that in a minute here. So Andrews is one of the anarchist writers who writes, what Jesus says is so important, that forgiveness is not what we preach, but what we practice. So we maybe have a tendency to tell people what they should do or should not do without actually doing it ourselves. This is like a hypocritical, and that's one of the big problems that people have with evangelicals. I have a book named Unchristian, which talks about exactly that. He talks about the 3 things that are driving the new generations away from the church is hypocrisy and judgment. And the third thing is, I think, is homophobia. Homophobia, yeah. So yeah, but to Andrew's point, we need to practice what we preach. So Hennessy, another one of these writers, says, we make retroactive laws and hang our defeated enemies, since we use the state to avenge and punish. So that's another thing that instead of forgiving, we hang and defeat our defeated enemies. So as, in other words, we kill them. And that's okay as long as it's state that's doing on our behalf. We kind of like wash our hands and let the state take care of it for us so we don't get our hands dirty. And we've seen that a couple of other times before, that the writers are talking about this way of distancing ourselves from the violence. It's okay as long as we don't have to do it ourselves. So yet to forgive 77 times, says Hennessy, means no Caesar at all, with the courts, prisons, and war. So in other words, he's saying that forgiving is, we don't need Caesar, we don't need the state to do that for us. Forgiveness means not punishing wrongdoers, but striving to love them, bless them, and to quote below again, referring one's cause always unto him who has said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. So, forgiveness is not punishing wrongdoers. I was just reading an article today from Denmark where a young girl was in an institution because she was a danger to herself and to others, and she simply couldn't live in normal circumstances. She had tried to stay at a less secure facility where she had threatened one of the leaders with a knife. So she had to move back to this more secure place, which is not a prison. She's not in a prison, but she is in a place where she cannot harm anyone or cause harm to herself. So she's, although the reason why she ended up in this place was because she did something terrible that she doesn't want to talk about, but the whole idea is that you are not punishing the person. You recognize that she has a mental illness and she needs to be cared for, loved and taken care of. But that, I think, doesn't happen in this country. I have never heard anybody in this country say, I've heard people say in this country, this is the approach we need to do here, but I never heard it actually happening. But it'll be interesting to hear if it is. So we leave vengeance to God, and He is all about love, so He doesn't punish people either. Hence, the forgiveness preached by Jesus undermines the state's instruments of coercion. Ballou thus considers the Gospel's repeated passages on forgiveness to be further proof of his radical and strict interpretation of turning the other cheek. So, again, another example of Jesus' message is to abolish the state, because it is demonic and evil. And it says here that there are many places in the Bible where he talks about forgiveness, and I can give you a few because it's in the footnote here. Matthew 6:7, Matthew 14 to 15, Matthew 18, 21 to 22, and Mark 11, 25 to 26, and Luke 6, 37. Those are all places where Jesus is talking about forgiveness. If you want to interested in looking them up and see what they say. So we're talking about Baloo here is saying, moreover, he remarks that Jesus is not speaking of mere envious grudges. So this paragraph talks about what kind of offenses should be forgiven. It's not talking about trivial faults, like somebody cutting you off in traffic. It's talking about offenses that, according to the common law, might rightfully be punished, it says. So it's like something really serious where forgiveness is in order. Jesus is calling for his followers to forgive precisely those whose offenses would justify legitimate retaliation. So assuming there is a legitimate, that retaliation is legitimate, those are the kind of people we need to forgive. And so here in the last paragraph on this chapter it says, Jesus also explains that his disciples should forgive if they want to be forgiven themselves. So I think one of the passages where it talks about forgiving is, but if you don't forgive, then God will not forgive you either. I've thought about that many times and say, oh, whoa. But this, I think, it explains it a little bit, because we had in the past, when we talked about the violence, that if you are violent to another person, then you imply that it is okay for that person to be violent towards you, right? So, in other words, if you turn that around and replace violence with forgiveness, so if you do not extend your forgiveness to that other person, then you cannot really expect them to forgive you when you offend either. Of course, you might think that you are so perfect that you never offend anybody, but that is probably not true. Okay, so Baloo reminds us that we have all sinned against our Father and are justly punishable at his hands, and that if we are hoping for God's grace and mercy, we should exercise it ourselves. That's what there's Baloo saying that. Yet, he notes, millions of professing Christians authorize aid and abet war, capital punishment, and the whole catalog of penal injuries. Still, they daily pray God to forgive for their trespasses as they forgive. So, in other words, people who say they're Christians, they authorize because they vote for lawmakers who make laws that aid and abet in war, producing a budget that includes billions of dollars in war materials. Capital punishment, we still have the death penalty in this country, and it's being exercised sometimes repeatedly. Just not too long ago, I heard a message about a man who was on death row, scheduled to be executed, and his intelligence, his mental capacity was that of a 4-year-old. So you cannot really expect him to know what's right and what's wrong. So now, but I think they executed him anyway. And so you think, what's the next step? When will they execute actual 4-year-olds? So it is a little bit horrible. And the whole catalog of penal injuries. So this whole prison system that we have is that's something that the professing Christians also advocate that we should have. Still they pray to God and asking Him to forgive them their trespasses as they forgive. So, and that's he's written that in cursive to emphasize as they forgive. So in other words, because they don't forgive offenders, then God should not forgive them either, or will not forgive them either. In the Lord's Prayer, Christians ask to be forgiven as they themselves forgive. So if they don't forgive, they're not going to be forgiven. Yet foolishly, they continue to perpetrate punishments and retaliation through the state. And again, so that's, in other words, still saying that when the state does it and you don't get your hands dirty, then it's okay. If they really sought God's forgiveness, they would strive to forgive even the worst offenses. And they would disentangle themselves from the state's instrument of the retaliation. So, in other words, Jesus is preaching against this idea that it's okay for the state to punish on our behalf. And that is the essence of Christian anarchism, that the anarchists say that it follows from that Jesus' counsel to forgive further confirms that what follows from Christianity is anarchism. So in other words, if you are a Christian following Jesus, then the world would be anarchist. So that's it for tonight, and the next week we're going to go on to not judging one another. And it's going to be interesting to see how that we have touched on it before, but we'll do it again. So thank you for coming. I appreciate that, and see you next week.